Every morning, 100,000 people in Tudor London woke up thirsty. And every morning, they reached for something to drink, knowing, in the way you know things you have learned to stop thinking about, that whatever filled the cup was not quite right. The water came from a river that carried the city's sewage back and forth with every tide. The ale came from breweries that used the same water and sometimes forgot to boil it long enough. The wine had been sweetened with a white powder that tasted like sugar and was, in fact, dissolved lead. And the cup itself, the pewter, the pottery, the glaze on the jug your mother poured from every morning of your childhood, was leaching poison into whatever it held, slowly, invisibly, one meal at a time. There was nothing safe to drink in Tudor London, nothing. Not the water, not the ale, not the wine, not the milk you gave your children. Every liquid that touched your lips had passed through lead or sewage or both, and no one alive had the science to know what that was doing to the bodies that drank it. The headaches came first, then the stomach pains, then the trembling in the hands, the confusion, the children who seized in their cradles and died before anyone thought to look at what they had been swallowing since the day they were born. The city did not know it was poisoning itself. The parish clerk recorded the deaths, colic, flux, convulsions, decline, and never once looked at the cup. What Tudor Londoners were actually drinking and what it was doing to them from the inside out is a story that will change how you see this city, this century, and every portrait of Tudor greatness you have ever been shown. If you want to understand what life really looked like beneath the crown, subscribe now. A cup, wooden mostly, though pewter if the household could afford it, and ceramic if it could not. Sitting on a table in a house somewhere in the parish of St. Botolph, or Cripplegate, or Farringdon without. It has been filled this morning by a servant, or by the woman of the house, or by a child sent to the conduit at the end of the lane with a bucket. The water inside it is not clean. It is not dirty in the way a modern person would recognize. There is no visible filth, no obvious color, no floating debris. It looks like water. It smells faintly of something that is not quite water. And it will be drunk, because there is nothing else to drink at this hour, and the ale will not be ready until later, and the household cannot afford wine, and the Thames is 2 streets away, but the Thames is worse. Everything about Tudor London's water supply was compromised, not by accident, not by neglect in any way the city would have recognized, by design. The system worked like this. London's drinking water came from 3 sources: the Thames, a network of public conduits fed by natural springs, and private wells sunk into the ground beneath houses, courtyards and churchyards. The conduits were the best option, gravity-fed pipes carrying spring water from the hills north of the city to public fountains on Cheapside, Cornhill and other central locations. The Great Conduit had been delivering water to Cheapside since the 13th century. It was a point of civic pride. The city maintained it, repaired it, and celebrated it as evidence of London's modernity and order. The pipes were made of lead. Lead is soft, malleable, easy to work, resistant to corrosion, the ideal material for a water system by every measure available to a Tudor engineer. And lead dissolves in water, slowly, invisibly, particularly in soft water or water with slight acidity, precisely the kind of water that flowed through London's conduit system. Every cup filled from the Great Conduit, from the Little Conduit, from any of the public fountains that the city maintained with genuine care and considerable expense, contained dissolved lead. Not enough to taste, not enough to see. Enough, over years and decades of daily drinking, to accumulate in the blood, the bones, the kidneys, the brain. But the conduits were the good water. The Thames was something else entirely. John Stowe, writing his Survey of London in 1598, described the river with the precision of a man who had walked its banks for decades. He documented the wharves, the stairs, the landing points, the commercial traffic that made the Thames the most important waterway in England. What he also documented, with less enthusiasm but no less accuracy, was the waste. Every street ditch in the city drained toward the river. The public privies built over the riverbank discharged directly into the current. The tanners of Bermondsey poured their chemical baths, lime, urine, animal dung, into the water. The dyers released their runoff. The slaughterhouses of Eastcheap sent blood and offal downstream in quantities sufficient to discolour the water for yards from the outfall point, and the tide brought it back. Twice a day, the Thames reversed its flow. The sewage that had been carried downstream in the morning drifted back upstream in the afternoon, past the same water-drawing points, past the same stairs where water carriers filled their buckets, past the same households that had discharged it in the first place. London was drinking its own waste on a tidal schedule. The river did not flush, it recycled. The wells were worse in a different way. Dug into London's shallow water table, they drew from groundwater that was saturated with the city's accumulated filth. The cesspits, every house had one, or shared one, were rarely more than a few yards from the nearest well. The soil between them was the only filter, and London's soil had been absorbing human waste, animal waste, industrial runoff, and burial decomposition for centuries. The water that rose in a well in 1540 was water that had passed through layers of contamination no one could see and no one could name. A well in St. Bride's Parish, close to the Fleet Ditch, drew water that would have contained, though no one alive had the framework to identify them, fecal bacteria, dissolved organic waste, and the chemical residue of the tanning and metalworking trades that lined the Fleet's banks. The city knew the water was bad, not in microbiological terms. Those concepts would not exist for 300 years, but in sensory terms. Petitions survive in the city. Letterbooks, residents complaining that a particular well had become foul, that a conduit had been contaminated by a nearby trade, that the water from a specific source had changed in colour or smell. The responses varied. Sometimes the city ordered repairs. Sometimes it prosecuted a polluter. Sometimes, and this is the detail I find hardest to sit with, it did nothing. A petition from a parish requesting that a contaminated well be closed. Denied? The well remained open. The water remained in use. The residents continued to drink it because the alternative was the Thames, or the conduit 2 miles away, or no water at all. The city was not indifferent. It was trapped. 100,000 people needed water. The infrastructure that delivered it was the best available. And the contamination, the invisible, deadly, slow contamination, was built into the system at every level, from the lead in the pipes, to the sewage in the river, to the cesspit leaching into the well. The supply was the poison, and the poison was the supply. The cup sits on the table. The child drinks. 1 gallon a day, sometimes 2. That was the ordinary consumption of ale for an adult in Tudor London, a quantity that sounds like alcoholism by modern standards, but was, in the 16th century, closer to a survival strategy. The logic was simple, even if no one alive could have explained it in the terms we use today. Water made you sick. Ale did not, or at least not as often and not in the same way. The brewing process required boiling the water, which killed the bacteria that no Tudor brewer knew existed. The fermentation produced alcohol, which suppressed the growth of pathogens that no Tudor physician had the tools to detect. The result was a drink that was, by default, safer than anything that came from a well or a conduit or the Thames. Not because anyone understood why, because experience, generations of it, accumulated in households and alehouses and breweries across the city, had taught them that ale kept you alive and water sometimes did not. Everyone drank it, men and women, labourers and merchants. Servants received it as part of their wages, a daily ration stipulated in household accounts alongside bread and meat. Children drank small beer, a weaker brew produced from the second or third running of the mash, with an alcohol content of perhaps 2 or 3%. enough to offer some protection against the waterborne diseases that killed thousands of Londoners every year. Not enough, in theory, to impair a child carrying water or sweeping a workshop floor, though the line between those two thresholds was thinner than anyone cared to examine, and the alehouses poured it. London had thousands of them. The exact number is impossible to pin down because many operated without licenses, in backrooms, in cellars, in private houses where a woman brewed a batch and sold it to her neighbours by the cup. The licensed alehouses were regulated, subject to the Assize of Ale, which set prices and quality standards, enforced by inspectors called ale conners, who were supposed to test each batch and ensure it met the city's requirements. The system looked robust on paper. In practice, it was riddled with the same gaps that compromised every Tudor regulatory framework. Too few inspectors, too many establishments, too much money to be made by cutting corners. The corners that were cut are where the safety failed. A brewer who boiled the water thoroughly and fermented the ale properly produced a drink that was, by the standards of the time, genuinely safe. But boiling required fuel, wood or coal, and fuel cost money. A brewer who shortened the boil or who topped up a batch with unboiled water to stretch the yield reintroduced exactly the contaminants that brewing was supposed to eliminate. The bacteria survived. The parasites survived. The customer, drinking what they believed was safe ale, was drinking Thames water with a faint taste of malt. And then there was the adulteration. Brewers added substances to disguise weak, spoiled, or insufficient batches. Chalk to reduce acidity. Salt to create thirst and encourage more drinking, a trick as old as the alehouse trade itself. Various plant extracts whose effects ranged from harmless to hallucinogenic to poisonous, depending on the plant, the dosage, and the honesty of the person selling the ingredient. The Assize regulations prohibited these additions. The regulations were enforced unevenly, and the customers, mostly poor, mostly illiterate, mostly without any means of testing what was in their cup, drank whatever was placed in front of them because the alternative was the water they already knew was worse. I want to be careful here about romanticizing ale as the Tudor solution to the water problem. It was not a solution, it was a less lethal alternative, most of the time, for most people, under most conditions. But when the brewing failed, or when the brewer cheated, or when the water used in the process was contaminated beyond what the boil could correct, ale killed too. Dysentery outbreaks cluster around specific alehouses in the city records. The bills of mortality record deaths from flux and griping in the guts in patterns that suggest localized contamination. A bad batch, a dirty barrel, a well behind a brewery that sat 3 yards from a cesspit. The pattern is there if you look for it. Nobody in Tudor London was looking for it. The alehouse served another function that complicates the story. It was the centre of working-class social life, the place where labourers gathered after work, where news was shared, where deals were struck, where communities formed. The authorities distrusted it for exactly this reason. An alehouse was a place where people talked, where grievances were aired, where the distance between the governed and the governors felt, for an evening, slightly less unbridgeable. The Crown and the City regulated alehouses not only for public health, a concept that barely existed in formal terms, but for public order. A sober population was a controllable population. A population that gathered every evening in thousands of unregulated establishments to drink and talk was something else. But the regulation was aimed at behaviour, not at safety. The inspectors checked prices and measures. They checked for drunkenness and disorder. They did not check, could not have checked, had no framework for checking, whether the ale contained the pathogens that were killing the customers who drank it quietly, at home, and died of what the parish clerk recorded as flux. The red and white barber's pole marked the place where your blood was drained. The alehouse sign marked the place where your drink was safe, except when it was not. And you could not tell the difference until the cramps began. What strikes me, after years with these trade records and tavern disputes, is how completely the class divide extended into the cup. The poor drank ale because they had to. The wealthy drank wine because they could. And both groups were being poisoned, just by different mechanisms through different liquids at different speeds. Wine in Tudor England was an import. The country's climate could not produce it in any meaningful quantity. A few monastic vineyards had existed before the dissolution, but their output was negligible and their quality, by continental standards, unremarkable. The wine that filled London's taverns and wealthy households came from abroad. Claret from Gascony, Sack from Spain and the Canary Islands, Rhenish from the German states, Malmsey from the Mediterranean. It arrived in barrels after weeks or months at sea, passed through the hands of merchants and middlemen, sat in warehouses and tavern cellars, and was eventually poured into a cup that the customer trusted because the price suggested quality. The price lied. Wine fraud in Tudor London was not an occasional crime committed by a few dishonest tavern keepers. It was an industry. The economics made it inevitable. Imported wine was expensive, the markup was enormous, and the gap between what a customer expected and what a customer could detect was wide enough to drive a cart through. A barrel of cheap Spanish wine could be transformed, with the right additions, into something that passed for fine Gascon claret at 3 times the price. The additives varied, the intent did not. Water was the simplest fraud. Dilution, pure and straightforward, stretching a barrel to fill more cups. Honey or sugar disguised the thinness. Chalk or lime neutralized the sourness that came from wine that had turned during the voyage or spoiled in storage. Sulfur was burned inside barrels before filling to preserve the contents, a practice that left a chemical residue in the wine and a taste that customers learned to associate with imported quality, not realizing it was the taste of preservation masking deterioration. And then there was the lead. There. Sugar of lead, lead acetate, is a white crystalline compound with a distinctly sweet taste. It dissolves readily in liquid. It was known across Europe, had been used for centuries, and it solved a specific problem that plagued the wine trade. Sourness. Wine that had turned during transport, wine that had been stored too long, wine that was simply cheap and harsh. A measure of lead acetate made it sweet, smooth, drinkable. The transformation was immediate and convincing. A cup of sour Spanish plonk became, with a few grains of white powder, something a gentleman would pay double for. The sweetness was lead entering the bloodstream. The connection between sweet wine and illness was observed, not in Tudor England with any systematic clarity, but across Europe, across centuries, in patterns that would not be formally identified until much later. George Baker, writing in 1767, traced the Devonshire colic, chronic abdominal pain endemic among cider drinkers in southwest England, to lead leaching from the lead-lined cider presses. The mechanism was identical to what was happening in Tudor wine. Lead dissolving into acidic liquid, ingested daily, accumulating in the body over months and years. Baker was describing an 18th century problem, but the chemistry was the same in the 16th century. The lead did not care what century it was in. I should be honest about the evidence here. Direct Tudor era. English documentation of lead acetate being added to wine is thinner than I would like. The continental evidence is strong. Italian and German sources describe the practice explicitly, and regulations against it appear in European cities throughout the period. The English evidence is circumstantial but consistent. The Crown and the City regulated wine adulteration repeatedly, which proves the practice existed and was widespread enough to warrant legislation. The health patterns, endemic colic, gut complaints, neurological symptoms in heavy wine drinkers are consistent with chronic lead exposure. And the compound itself was readily available, cheap, effective, and undetectable by any means a Tudor customer possessed. The probability is high, the certainty is not. But consider the position of the customer. A merchant, a lawyer, a gentleman, someone wealthy enough to drink wine regularly, Someone who chose wine precisely because it was supposed to be better than the ale the common people drank. He sits in a tavern on Fleet Street or Ludgate Hill. He orders a cup of claret. The tavern keeper pours it from a barrel that arrived ostensibly from Bordeaux. The wine is smooth, it is sweet, it tastes like quality. The customer pays, he drinks, he comes back tomorrow. He comes back every day for years, and inside his body, in his gut, his kidneys, his bones, his brain, the lead is building. Slowly, invisibly, producing symptoms that his physician will attribute to gout, to excess, to age, to the imbalance of humours that explains everything and identifies nothing. He will be bled for the colic, he will be purged for the headaches, the treatments will weaken him further. And if you watched the previous episode on Tudor medicine, you already understand what those treatments did. And the wine, the sweet, expensive, carefully chosen wine that was supposed to mark his distance from the dirty water the poor drank, will continue to sit on his table, refilled every evening until the symptoms become so severe that he can no longer lift the cup. The regulations existed. The assize of wine set prices and standards. Inspectors visited taverns. Fines were levied. Licenses were revoked. The system functioned on paper. In practice, the profit margins were too large, the inspections too infrequent, the detection methods too primitive, and the customers too trusting. The fraud continued because it worked, the lead accumulated because it could not be seen, and the parish clerk, recording another death from colic or surfeit or decline, never looked at the cup on the dead man's table. Nobody did. A woman stands in a kitchen in Bishopsgate. It is early morning, the fire is lit, the bread is cut, the children are not yet awake. She reaches for a jug. Pewter, heavy in the hand, slightly tarnished along the rim where her thumb has worn the same spot for years. She pours ale into a cup for her husband and water into a smaller vessel for the porridge. The jug has been in the household since before her marriage. It will be in the household after her death. It is, by the standards of her world, a good piece, solid, well-made, a step above the wooden cups her neighbours use. The pewter is killing her family, not quickly, not dramatically. One cup at a time, one meal at a time, over years that will accumulate into damage that no physician in England has the tools to diagnose. Pewter is an alloy. At its best, the fine pewter used in wealthy households and by the Pewterers' Company for their display pieces. It was primarily tin with small amounts of copper or bismuth for hardness. At its worst, the lay or black pewter sold cheaply in markets and shops across London. It contained lead in proportions that could reach 30% or higher. The cheaper the vessel, the more lead it contained. The more lead it contained, the more it leached into whatever liquid sat inside it. And acidic liquids, ale, wine, cider, vinegars, anything used in cooking dissolved the lead faster than water alone. The Pewterers' Company regulated the trade. Standards existed. Marks were stamped into vessels to indicate quality. But enforcement operated on the same principle as every other Tudor regulation, intermittently, imperfectly, and with limited reach beyond the city's core. The pewter that a Cheapside merchant bought from a licensed pewterer met the company's standards most of the time. The pewter that a Suffolk labourer bought from an unlicensed seller at a market stall did not. The gap between regulated and unregulated was the gap between survivable exposure and chronic poisoning. And the people on the wrong side of that gap were, as always, the people who could least afford to be there. But pewter was only one source. The lead was everywhere. The conduit pipes, already discussed. Lead-lined, feeding dissolved metal into every cup of public water drawn from the city's proudest infrastructure. The glazed pottery that sat on tables across every class of household. The glaze was lead oxide, smooth and attractive, waterproof and practical, and it leached into food and drink with every use. The cooking pots, some ceramic with lead glaze, some metal with lead solder at the joints, released lead into heated food at rates that increased with temperature and acidity. A stew simmered for hours in a lead-glazed pot. A sauce made with vinegar stored in a pewter vessel. Ale poured from a lead-soldered tap. Wine served in a pewter cup. Water drawn through lead pipes. Every meal, every drink, every day, from birth. Think about what that means, not as a historical curiosity, but as a physical reality experienced by a human body. Not a single dramatic poisoning. Not a contaminated well that sickens a neighborhood in a week. A lifetime of invisible exposure, entering through every cup, every plate, every pipe, building in the blood and the bones and the soft tissue of the brain for decades. You would never feel the moment it began. There would be no first symptom you could point to and say, this is when it started. The headaches would come gradually. The fatigue would creep in so slowly that you would attribute it to age, or to work, or to the damp. The abdominal pain, the colic that appears again and again in the medical texts and the bills of mortality, would arrive one winter and never fully leave. Your hands might tremble, your memory might thin, your temper might shorten in ways your family noticed but could not explain. And you would go to a physician. And the physician, working inside the same humoral framework described in the previous episode, would diagnose an imbalance. Excess bile, corrupt humors. He would bleed you. He would purge you. He would prescribe a remedy that might, depending on its composition, contain additional lead. And the cause, the cup, the jug, the pipe, the pot, the glaze, would remain on your table, unexamined, unsuspected, waiting for your next meal. The wealthy were not exempt. Their pewter was better, less lead, finer alloy, but they drank more wine, and the wine, as Part 3 described, carried its own lead burden. They used cosmetics containing lead, ceruse, the white face paint that the previous episode on Tudor medicine documented in detail. Their houses had more elaborate water systems, with more lead pipe, carrying water longer distances through more metal. A wealthy woman in Tudor London might be ingesting lead from her water, her wine, her face cream, her cooking vessels, and her pewter simultaneously. 5 separate sources, each one invisible, each one contributing to a cumulative dose that her physicians would never identify and her parish register would never record accurately. The system was not designed to poison anyone. I want to be clear about that because the temptation, the modern temptation, is to read malice into what was actually infrastructure. Lead was used because it worked. It was abundant, cheap, easy to shape, resistant to corrosion, and effective for every purpose it was applied to. The pipes delivered water. The pewter held ale. The glaze sealed pottery. The solder joined metal. Every application solved a practical problem. The fact that every application also introduced a cumulative neurotoxin into the bodies of the people who depended on these objects was invisible, not concealed, not suppressed, but genuinely invisible, beyond the reach of any science or any framework of understanding available to the people who were being harmed. The bills of mortality sit in archives across London, handwritten, fragile, the ink fading toward brown. They record causes of death by the week, by the parish, by the year. Colic appears with a frequency that modern epidemiologists find striking, griping in the guts. Convulsions, especially in children, especially in infants, in numbers that spike in certain parishes and certain seasons, in patterns consistent with acute lead exposure from contaminated milk stored in lead-glazed vessels or water drawn from newly repaired lead pipes. The searchers, the elderly women who examined the bodies and assigned the causes, wrote down what they saw. Abdominal distension, evidence of pain. The blue-grey pallor that we now associate with lead poisoning, but that they associated with nothing, because the association did not yet exist. They recorded it honestly. They recorded it accurately within the limits of their knowledge. And they had no idea what they were recording. Stand back for a moment, not from London, from the detail, from the pipes and the pewter and the parish registers and the individual cups on individual tables. Stand far enough back to see the whole system at once and ask the question that no one inside it could have asked. What was the city doing to itself? 100,000 people, every one of them thirsty, every one of them reaching every day for a drink that was compromised by forces they could not detect, supplied by infrastructure they could not replace, and consumed inside a framework of knowledge that had no category for the harm it was causing. The water carried sewage and dissolved lead. The ale was safer until the brewer cut corners, or the barrel sat too long, or the well behind the brewery leached the same contaminants the brewing was supposed to eliminate. Partially, imperfectly, in the only, partially, imperfectly, in the only language available. Stowe documented the decline of London's water sources with the care of a man who loved the city and could see it deteriorating. He wrote about wells that had gone foul, conduits that had silted up or been diverted. The Fleet Ditch, once a navigable river feeding into the Thames, reduced by his lifetime to an open sewer so choked with refuse that it barely moved, its banks lined with tanners and butchers and dyers whose waste poured into a channel that still, nominally, fed into the city's water system. He recorded what he saw. He smelled what everyone smelled, and his response, the city's response, the only response available, was directed at the symptoms. Clear the blockage, prosecute the worst polluters, repair the conduit, move the tannery downstream. The interventions were real, the effort was genuine, and the fundamental problem remained untouched because the fundamental problem was invisible. Germ theory did not exist. The idea that disease could be caused by organisms too small to see, carried in water that looked and tasted acceptable, transmitted through mechanisms that left no trace the human senses could detect. This concept would not emerge for 300 years. The framework that did exist was miasma theory. Disease came from bad air, from foul smells, from the corruption of the atmosphere by rotting matter and stagnant vapor. The response to contaminated water was therefore directed at the smell. If the water smelled foul, it was dangerous. If it smelled acceptable, it was safe. Cover the ditch, redirect the effluent, scent the air with herbs and fires. The logic was consistent, the science was wrong, and the pathogens, the cholera, the typhoid, the dysentery, the parasites, passed through every intervention because the interventions were aimed at the wrong target. A well that smelled clean could still carry 1,000 lethal organisms per cup. A conduit that ran clear and cold through freshly repaired lead pipes could still deliver a slow poison that accumulated across decades. The senses were the only diagnostic tool available, and the senses were inadequate to the task. The lead was worse, in a way, because it operated on a timeline that made cause and effect impossible to connect. A man who drank contaminated water and developed dysentery within days could at least, in theory, associate the illness with the water, even if the mechanism was invisible. But a man who drank from a pewter cup for 30 years and developed tremors, memory loss, and chronic abdominal pain had no way to connect the symptoms to the vessel. The gap between exposure and effect was too long. The sources were too numerous. The symptoms overlapped with too many other conditions: age, gout, excess, the dozens of ailments that Tudor medicine attributed to humoral imbalance. Lead poisoning hid inside other diagnoses the way the lead itself hid inside the cup. Invisible at every stage. And the children. This is the part I keep circling back to, the part that resists the professional distance I try to maintain with these sources. The bills of mortality record convulsions as a cause of death in infants and young children with a frequency that modern pediatricians find alarming. Convulsions in infants can have many causes, but lead poisoning is among the most common in historical populations with high environmental lead exposure. And Tudor London was, by any measure, a high-exposure environment. An infant drinking milk stored in a lead-glazed vessel. A toddler putting a pewter spoon in its mouth. a child drinking small beer poured from a lead-soldered tap into a cheap pewter cup. The exposure began at birth. The developing brain is more vulnerable to lead than the adult brain. The damage, cognitive, behavioral, neurological, was occurring in children who had no choice, no voice, and no advocate who understood what was happening to them. The searchers wrote, "Convulsions in the register." They wrote it in the same steady hand they used for flux and griping and surfeit and decline. They wrote it because that is what they saw. A child seizing, a child dying, a cause that needed a name, so the entry could be completed and the register closed for the week. They did not write lead. They could not have written lead. The connection between the metal in the cup and the seizure in the cradle would not be established for centuries. The distance between the cause and its recognition is one of the longest silences in the history of public health. Nobody poisoned Tudor London. No villain, no conspiracy, no act of malice. The city poisoned itself through infrastructure built with the best materials available, maintained with genuine effort, and contaminated by processes that no one alive had the science to detect or the vocabulary to name. The water pipes solved the problem of supply and introduced the problem of lead. The brewing process solved the problem of waterborne disease and created a population dependent on alcohol from childhood. The wine trade solved the problem of taste and introduced a sweetener that was indistinguishable from quality and indistinguishable from poison. Every solution carried its own invisible cost. Every cup was a compromise between what the city needed and what the city could not see. The parish registers record the dead. They record the flux and the colic and the convulsions and the griping of the guts. They do not record what was in the cup. That connection between what Tudor Londoners drank and what Tudor Londoners died of was invisible to everyone who held the pen. It would take 300 years and a revolution in science that no one in the 16th century could have imagined before anyone understood that the most dangerous thing in a Tudor home was not the disease that came through the door. It was the drink that was already on the table.